in Europe and the UK, and good morning, perhaps, to those who are in the US, and very good late evening if anybody's still up in Asia. And welcome to this particular webinar. It's the last day of the three-day summit that we have at Armstrong Wolf, where we're talking about conduct and culture with a particular emphasis on purpose over profit. We've had an extraordinary conversation with COOs, with professionals, with academics, with regulators, and also with a number of other executives and advisors over the last few days, ranging from subjects such as basically mission-oriented decision-making in the military, to the senior management or Series 24 role in driving conduct and culture and performance, to some of the technologies that are available, and also to the future role of the COO. Today, we're going to talk about speaking up versus whistleblowing. It's a subject that has been touched on in a number of other sessions over the last couple of days, particularly where it revolves around psychological safety. But we're going to take a slightly different tack on this. We're going to look at it as the possibility of creating value, of turning something that we have to do into something that is going to create value in the firm. And I'll sort of outline the, if you like, the thesis in a minute or two. Before I do that, I'd like to just introduce the panel. Just before that, just for those who haven't met me, my name is Patrick Butler. I am the managing partner of the Armstrong Wolf Institute. I have a previous career in banking as an M&A banker, as an operating officer, and as a compliance officer, all in transformation roles, and more recently in also building a number of frameworks for firms, as well as academies and environments where we can dig into conduct and culture, how it can drive value for the firm, including the UK Finance Conduct and Culture Academy. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce members of our panel, and I'm just going to go as to how they have appeared randomly on my screen. First of all, if I could, at each one, I'm going to ask just to give a couple of minutes about their experience and where they're coming from. Alexandra Stanton, if you could just give us a couple of minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you very much for having me, and hello to everyone. I'm a lawyer by training. For many years, I first started working in private practice, and I moved to a global investment bank, so ostensibly managing legal and reputational risk in my investment banking role as a fixed income new issues lawyer. I moved over to a first line of control team, the conduct and culture team, really sitting in front office, and they're absolutely designing and implementing first line controls, but it quickly, and that's absolutely crucial, but it quickly became apparent to me that you can't control everything. And where the controls stop, you need to inform people's decision-making by reference to principles and values of the firm, but also to enable them to use their good judgment. And also, very crucially as well, is to create those psychologically safe environments so that people can speak up if they see something which doesn't quite work, if somebody is subverting controls, that they feel comfortable enough to flag that. So very much as a supplement to the control framework. Thank you, Alex.
And Helen Hughes-Green, who many of you may have already seen on a couple of the other panels that we've had so far, who's contributed some extraordinary experiences and very valuable insights to the summit so far. Helen, welcome.
Patrick, thank you. So I'm Helen Hughes-Green. I'm the Chief Conduct Controls Officer at Standard Chartered. I started my life actually as a mechanical engineer on a gas platform in the Netherlands, and then decided it was way too cold out on a platform, and have worked for energy majors and banks for the last 20 years, looking actually at pretty much every department across the trade life cycle before my current role, looking at controls and conduct across first line. And having done a very rational degree in the first place, I started to get really interested in human behaviour. So a couple of years ago, went to INSEAD and did a coaching and consulting master's there, looking at the psychodynamics of individuals, teams, and organisations. And that's really where I'm now focusing, is how can we take that learning about what's going on below the surface and use that to positively influence culture and conduct within the banking sector. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Helen. And next on my screen is Carl Hewitt from Scion. Carl, welcome.
Hi, hi folks, and first of all, let me extend my my thanks to Armstrong Wolf for running such an interesting session. I've been attending many of the sessions over the last 2 days myself, and I really do find these kind of things super insightful. And my thanks to Maurice, to Patrick, to Gwen, and it's a privilege to be here and contribute to this. My background is, as Patrick, as you heard there, I work for a company called Psionic, and we are, we would position ourselves as specialists at scale. We work specifically with the finance services industry. My background myself is I have over 20 years of experience working in a range of different investment banks, predominantly in transformational change, actually. And within that transformational change, I've looked at systems, I've looked at process, organizational change, but also cultural and behavioral change. So that's really where my specialism is. And I'm also a leadership coach to numerous leaders across our industry. And that helps give us some very unique and specific insight. And having worked in compliance and operational risk myself, certainly within things like risk appetite assessment, I now head up the Ascent program in Psionic, which is about helping our clients cultivate a culture of appropriate conduct and really change the dial on where they sit. Like Helen, I did my first degree quite a long time ago, but I got a massive interest in human behavior, and I went on to do a master's degree in organizational behavior at Birkbeck quite recently. I'm also a Scrum Master as well from an Agile perspective. And I think bringing those things together gives me a slightly interesting and perhaps unique perspective on risk, on metrics, and I'm really looking forward to contributing to this conversation. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Carl. And finally, but by no means least, Rich Evans from DXC.
Thanks, Patrick.
Rich, welcome.
Hi all, Rich Evans. I lead regulatory and compliance solutions for a company called DXC Luxoft. We're an IT services company with many of the world's largest banks as our customers, including infrastructure providers and asset managers as well. My day job is looking at what regulation is coming and what solutions are available to solve the challenges that you'll all be facing over the next couple of years. Prior to DXC Luxoft, I spent 25 years within capital markets, more recently 6 years at Barclays through a significant period of change through 3 very different CEOs with different cultural focuses. I was firstly Chief Operating Officer for the global equities business, and then I subsequently ran the European equities business and led a number of conduct and culture investigations and training sessions through that. Earlier last decade, I was also the expert witness in one of the UK's largest fraud cases. That was the case of Kweku Adeboli versus UBS. And I also have a postgraduate diploma in corporate governance and boardroom behaviour.
Thank you, Rich. So as you can see, we have a wealth of experience and expertise from both if you like, the theory, the fundamentals of behavior, psychological safety, but also the practitioner aspect from all those on the panel. And with that, what I'd like to do is just start to share a couple of slides. I'm going to just position our argument, and then Carl's going to take us through a little bit of thesis about the fundamentals of the behavior and the sort of measurements that we might be able to start to think about, which will help us with this argument. And then we'll look at a couple of examples outside industry, one good, one not so good, about psychological safety, speaking up, and what impact it's had on the business to support the thesis. And with that, if I could show you where we are. So we're looking at whistleblowing frameworks and escalation paths as a governance structure. That's fundamental. So today is about governance. But what we're going to try to do is ask a slightly different question. We know we have to have it in place as a governance framework. It's about reporting and escalation. It needs to be in place from a whistleblowing point of view. but are we missing something? Are we missing an opportunity? And this is the key element. So when we look at these sorts of metrics, or we look at the whistleblowing framework that we have, sometimes we interpret the traditional metric of 0 or no whistleblowing events as everything is fine. The reality is that it could mean that there is fear. There's a rabid fear in the organization, and nobody is willing to speak up at all, even when they see something egregious in the organization. It could mean you have a healthy culture where people do speak up and issues get resolved at an early stage before they become sufficiently large to merit whistleblowing. The question is, how do we differentiate where our business is, what sort of culture it has, and what the if you like, what the environment is that will tell us if we're in a good place or in a very, very dangerous place. The advantage of being in the good place is that if we see and can measure the behaviors that lead to a good speak up culture, and we flip the coin, they actually drive value, because those are the same attributes, the same, if you like, characters and behavioral drivers of innovation. People who challenge the status quo, and they basically see changes in the environment, and then they put their hand up and say, look, we can profit from that, or we should change because we no longer fit the emerging environment, whether it's economic or client-based or product-based. So the question is, does the risk that social license is being lost by us not actually having a good handle on what's going on, is we may miss the fact that demoralization and distancing of our staff means that we are losing their support, their respect, which itself becomes a problem, because then we lose productivity at the same time. And by the time conduct reaches that whistleblowing event, culture has been damaged to such an extent that all your valued staff will actually walk away. But plus, the whistleblowing event ends up being extremely expensive and reputationally damaging to manage. So how and what metrics can we use to enable managers at every level to make a difference? And we're going to look at a couple of, as I said, examples outside finance. But key through all of this blue thread, if you like, is the role the COO might play in creating the right environment that turns what is a necessity from a governance perspective into something which will also drive positive, constructive, and value-creating behavior in the firm. I'm going to hand over to Carl now to take us through a couple of thought-provoking elements about what psychological safety means and how we might recognize it, or what we might do to try to foster it. Carl.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. I'll just share my screen. Right. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so what I'd like to do first of all is kind of start with the story, actually. And I'd like to look at the context of whistleblowing and speak up metrics. Or more accurately, I'd like to look at this concept and the way in which we think about metrics and the way in which we interpret metrics and interpret risk. So this is the story. This is a Ocellaris clownfish. And when I was younger, it's a story about me. My parents would say to me, Carl, eat your fish because fish gives you brains. Now, clearly, I would never want to eat Nemo. In fact, this image appeals to me because I've got a couple of Ocellaris clownfish at the side here called Leonard and Sheldon. They're a bit camera shy, so I'll keep going. But what the story is really about is, as I walk around the supermarket and I'm looking for a piece of fish to eat, I'm kind of thinking, well, fish is really healthy, right? It's going to give me a lot of health benefits. I have no idea whether it really gives you brains or not, but I'm sure it's full of goodness and omega-3 oils and all that kind of good stuff. What I certainly don't think about as I'm looking for fish in the supermarket, I don't think that actually what I want to do is I want to support a situation where there's a high risk of utilizing forced labor in fishing fleets. That would be a ludicrous thought. No one would think that, okay? But of course, well, I say of course, there was a recent study, in fact, January this year, which utilized satellite imagery and machine learning algorithms, and estimates that between 14 and 26% of the world's fishing fleet actually does use or is at a high risk of utilizing forced labor. Now, I'm sure many of our listeners here are going to recognize this as systems thinking. And Peter Senge, of course, talks a lot about this in his books and his lectures, and he might reference the fact that, we certainly don't have the intent to destroy the atmosphere or add to the greenhouse effect. And yet overnight we charge our hybrid cars, we charge our devices, and of course those devices may well be getting their power from coal-fired power stations. And if we understand that system, regardless of whether that's our intent or not, it is the outcome. And I used to be working in a Swiss bank, and I remember someone there telling me very, very succinctly, compliance really is an outcome. It's not just a process. So what do I mean? If I just go a little bit deeper into this sort of systems thinking analogy, often we will look at our problems from an analytical point of view. And clearly analysis is the dominant scientific paradigm underlying most modern sciences. And it's a very, very useful paradigm because it helps us by deconstructing certain elements and really looking at them, it helps us understand the components of those elements. And it's given us some tremendous scientific discoveries. But as much as it is useful in looking at the world in that way, it's also a way of not seeing the world. So the process of isolating the parts of the problem from each other might also de-promote focusing on the relationships that exist between those parts. So let's take a really simple example. People don't feel that they can speak up. Okay, so what's the interconnectivity of that? Well, then we might get improper conduct because people don't feel that they can speak up, and that might increase. But this is not a linear thing. Morale and standards might fall if we get improper conduct, and therefore people don't feel that they can speak up. And you can quickly see how this can become a negative reinforcing loop or a vicious circle. But of course, the story doesn't stop there. If morale falls, then perhaps innovation falls. If innovation falls, perhaps overall performance falls. And if that happens, morale and standards fall, in which case people don't think that they can speak up. And you can quickly see how the interconnectivity of these parts are almost as important as the parts themselves. So this is a sort of systemic way of looking at the world. So what can we do from a measurement standpoint? Well, we've talked a lot on in the last 2 days about lead indicators and lag indicators. So a lag indicator might well be a whistleblowing instance after the event or a speak up instance after the event. And maybe that's moving more towards a lead indicator. Lag indicators are really looking at risks that have crystallized into issues. But what can we do in order to understand where our risks actually are? What measures can we look at? Well, it's important to ask ourselves a couple of questions. What is it that we really want to know? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? And what information do we already have? So let me just go back to this concept of seeing as sometimes not seeing. And this is a quote by Kenneth Burke. And what do I mean by this? So imagine if you're standing out at nighttime looking up at the stars. It's a beautiful night. Very, very clear. You hear a sound in the grass, you pick up a torch and you shine the torch down on the grass. You see a mouse. So now you understand what's going on because you've shone a torch at a particular thing. You're laser focused on it and you understand that there's a mouse making that noise. But interestingly enough, if you were to turn the torch off and allow your eyes to adjust, you might find that there's a lot more going on in the situation than initially meets the eye, as it were. So what tools do we have to maybe go down these levels and have a look at this sort of systemic point of view? Well, this is a very common tool, the iceberg model. And I'm sure many of you will recognize this. We've got things at the top of the iceberg, events which are generally observed. So this might be the number of whistleblowing events or speak up instances. But there are also things underlying that, the patterns of behavior, the structures, the mental models. These might be the drivers of that event. So what might we be looking at on patterns of behavior, for instance? Well, we might be looking at the process for setting sales targets. Has the sales target just increased in a linear fashion, 5% year on year, or is there some kind of correlation of the individual sales target to expected market performance? Structures, well, performance management is a very powerful structure which influences the context in which people make decisions, right? So what weight is given to results in determining that performance grade? And certainly when I was working in a large UK bank, they introduced a concept where you would get a performance grade based on your results, but you would also get a performance grade based on how you achieved those results. So we've talked a lot about psychological safety, and clearly that's an important mental model. And there are certainly measures and systems that you can put in place to quantify psychological safety. For instance, Amy Edmondson's 7-item psychological safety survey is very robust. But there are also, or there may well be, information that exists in your organization already, which will give you an indication of psychological safety. And one of those things that I would posit would be the change portfolio dashboard. So let me give you an example. Psionic did a survey of over 200 risk managers across several investment banks. And we asked them some very specific questions about their risk culture. We found that a third of those surveyed said that there was an overwhelming culture of positive news, which made it very difficult to report issues. A third of those individuals, or a third of the people we surveyed, also said, even when you've reported a failure, that most people won't heed or won't notice that warning. And quite concerningly, a quarter of those that we surveyed actually said that there was an unwillingness to speak out, even when it was quite clear that the project has gone off track. We wanted to go a little bit deeper and look at the narratives that were used behind this. So we asked this question: how would you escalate your concerns? And what we found is between 25 and 30, so 55% of individuals would merely either make a suggestion or express an opinion. 41% said they would take no action at all, and 4% said they would actually issue an instruction. So this tells you a lot about the psychological safety, by proxy, as it were, of those organizations. And coming back to those measures and metrics, and let's get into that discussion. I guess pilots, you know, when you're flying an aeroplane, you are relying on a range of different indicators to give you an image of the world beyond. But unlike those instruments, when we look at our dashboards, what we need to figure in, as it were, to account for is this element of human software. That data has been brought together by humans, interpreted by humans, and then reported by humans. So could the dashboard of green across the board, could a really positive dashboard actually paradoxically be the biggest indicator that something's going awry, because it's underlying this culture, this narrative of an overwhelming positive culture of, or positive news, culture of positive news. So let me pause there, and I'm really looking forward to getting to that debate. Patrick, if I hand back over to you at this stage, that's okay, and we can get into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Carl. So as we can see, there are methods, there are ways, and we can start to pick out the detail that underlies it. And there are some very specific examples and points and experiences that members of our panels can provide to illustrate this. So if we take that last point and look at, for example, aviation, as already mentioned by Carl, what the pilot uses, but let's look at how civil aviation has a culture of non-punitive safety reporting. In this case, of course, a willful violation is not acceptable, but an honest mistake is. And this, if you like, goes back to some of the character discussions that we had on the first day with Mary Crossan, that justice and fairness are key in creating an environment where people are not worried about raising an honest mistake. What this ended up meaning was that the civil aviation industry moved from compliance-based to performance-based approach. And it meant that frontline staff were enabled to detect what was going on when there were problems. And what it did was it improved a near-miss event risk by 5 times. It reduced from 42 per million flights, basically, to 8 per million operations over 30 years. And what we've seen is that there is a culture also of learning, of collaboration in aviation. So if a mechanic on the apron loses his spanner, they ground all flights until they find it. Then they find out how it was that he lost the spanner, or she lost her spanner, and where it was, how that occurred, find a solution, how do we prevent this happening again? And then once they've done that, they share that with all other airlines and airports and manufacturers and engineering units. We compare that with something like the healthcare system. And I'm going to, excuse me, to our colleagues across in North America, but when we look at the comparison with the healthcare industry in the US, there are about 400,000 fatalities caused by preventable medical error in the US, the equivalent of 2 jumbo jets falling out of the sky every day. So in this case, medical mistakes can often be spun or denied, and lessons rarely learned. And part of the reason is this is the fear of malpractice lawsuits, or the fear of not being seen to be an expert in your field, whether you're a consultant, a general practitioner, or a nurse, or a porter, or anybody working in that industry, anaesthetists, radiologists, and so on. What we've seen is that these sorts of situations can flip over. So Boeing, for example, we all know about the 737 MAX disaster. And this was created when Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, and the culture in McDonnell Douglas of shaving costs, driving for profitability was imported into Boeing. And when they saw that the Airbus environmentally friendly and highly efficient engines that had been produced for that were about to be launched, Boeing realized we need to compete with this. And they were years off being able to produce a competitive airline. So what they did is they took an old one and they fixed it up a little bit, which meant that they could circumvent many of the rules. They didn't have to have full FAA authorization for the new craft, because it wasn't new. It was adapted and adjusted. So this was a shortcut. This was using the rules, circumventing, bending the rules, as opposed to applying the spirit of it. And we ended up with the 737 MAX, hadn't been properly tested, hadn't been properly validated, and people died. Now, on the other side, if we take an example of the Virginia Mason Hospital near Seattle in the northwest of the US, this was a hospital which in the late 90s had an appalling track record for survival and for failures, preventable errors. New CEO came in, and he instituted a regime of rewarding people to raise concerns. And most people didn't think this was going to be helpful, but it was. Finally, somebody had the courage to test the system and say, okay, I think we've got a problem here. When they didn't have their head cut off, they weren't fired, everybody realized that this was a true change in the organization. And all of a sudden, there was this massive spike in failure reporting, which in many organizations, for example, in the UK, would cause a hospital to be put into special measures and real concerns to be raised. But just like our whistleblowing point at the beginning, this was a sudden rise in reporting. This was not a sudden rise in incidences. Very, very different. 6 to 9 months later, the survival rates followed suit, and they rose drastically. And Virginia Mason is now considered to be one of the most successful and most award-winning hospitals in the world, and a world leader in healthcare transformation. Better care at lower cost. And part of this is the approach that they took, the inclusive approach, creating an environment of psychological safety, importing examples from outside the industry, so that they looked at what their purpose was. It was about patient experience as opposed to personal security and safety for an individual and their reputation or their self-awareness. And what they did is they brought team members to be involved, they brought patients and families involved, and they created an environment of transparency, which meant that they were able to innovate at a much faster rate than any other hospital. And they become one of the, as I say, one of the most successful hospitals in North America and in the world. So a couple of examples from outside industry. And I'd like to turn to our panel now and get some of their experience, because there are some real connections with some of what Carl has pointed out and some of these examples themselves. And perhaps what I can do is actually turn to Rich first. particularly as we look at the this question of raising concerns versus action, which was the last slide that Carl put up. The question is, many people said, well, I don't feel comfortable raising concerns. Other people said, I don't think anything's going to happen. And so what that actually creates in the environment. And from your point of view, Carl, Rich, this is something which has a particular sort of resonance for you, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So a couple of examples that maybe bring this to light. Firstly, just remembering my experiences of being expert witness in the Adeboli trial. When I think about what fundamentally went wrong there, you had an individual who made an error early on in his career and found a way to hide that error. What that subsequently led to was a pattern of behavior that led to significant losses for the bank. But when that individual made the error, it didn't seem in the experience that I've had and the evidence that I've seen that he raised that to anybody within the bank. He just found a way of hiding it. And if there was a way for him to raise that concern, if the culture was there that was similar to the airline example, where he felt like raising that concern because he was down $300,000, I think it was, for missing a trade, then that could have avoided a whole host of follow-on actions. He didn't tell anyone who could help him take that problem away from him. And I think part of the issue that we have with the whistleblowing culture at the moment is twofold. Firstly, when concerns are raised, it's not clear whether things are actually actioned as a result of those concerns being raised. Partly because of confidential information, partly because sometimes it may be as a result of inappropriate share dealing or transactions, and therefore the information can't be used for sharing back for tipping off purposes. But we have to be able to better describe the outcome of what's taken place as a result of concerns being raised. And I don't see enough of that within the industries that I've worked at. The second thing I think we really need to have an improvement on is the point around creating this culture of fairness and psychological safety. There are multiple examples where either concerns are raised and they are ignored. We can look at two recent events, Greensill and Archegos, where concerns were raised, but no action was taken as a result of those concerns, if you read the recent press. So if people are raising concerns, who actually is going to listen to those concerns and take the appropriate action as a result of them being raised? And coupled with that, we've got to remove some of the perceived hypocrisy within organizations where issues are raised, whistleblowing processes are not necessarily heeded by senior individuals within organizations. And in fact, it takes an age for a resolution to come out. Two examples of investigations that I've been close to are over a year for what would be considered to be very straightforward investigations, where if you're a more junior individual within the organization, it would be resolved far quicker. So that transparency when people do raise concerns really needs to be improved.
And as part of the issue, Rich, you think that the whistleblowing process, if you like, is very legalized, cumbersome. It has a huge amount of policy and procedure around it, many people involved, which means that if that is the only route for anybody, it actually creates fear of actually going down that process, because it turns your stomach a little bit.
Absolutely, I think that's part of it. But practical experience as well from my previous role is that often individual investigators are requested from the business who also have day jobs, and that elongates the process of the investigation. So an example, I would have been asked to be an independent investigator on something that would have happened outside of my direct business and provide the be the investigator and provide the outcome of that investigation. But unfortunately, because I also have a day job, that elongates the process, as well as it being a legalistic process. So that slows things down. And that leads to a lack of transparency, and therefore people thinking that no action is actually being taken as a result of raising concerns.
Thank you. That's very. I'm going to make that as a note, as something as a takeaway for us, that the resourcing of it is a key thing, and that may be something that is in the COO's purview, or at least their influence in ensuring that you have the ability to move these things fast because of the fear. And on that fear question, I'd like to turn to Helen. So Helen, from that perspective, in terms of some of the fear, or highlighting fear, and the subtlety that can have in being embedded in an organization, and particularly from your perspective as a COO, having had that experience from an engineering, we think of as a very rational approach, but taking that to start looking at people who are, as Dan Ariely says, predictably irrational. Sort of how does that perspective? What is your experience on that?
Yeah, thanks. So the kind of common approach that we've taken on conduct so far has been very much a quantitative approach. We look at quantitative data points, and everybody's very comfortable with that because you produce a nice dashboard, you have red, amber, green, and you think that everything's great. But actually, that isn't the whole picture. And one thing that I've been doing recently is a lot of work coaching and sponsoring, particularly women in the organization. And that has given me the opportunity to speak with 50 people in different teams outside of my own team to talk specifically about where you are facing problems in the organization, where do you need coaching, where do you need support. And why I'm particularly interested in the women angle is, firstly, I'm very pro D&I, and I think that organizations are better when they are diverse and inclusive. But also, when we look at group dynamics, minority groups, I think, are more alert to some of the behavioral changes that are required for them to fit in, to belong to the group as a whole. And when I've spoken to these women, there are themes coming up. And one of the themes is very much this distrust in the organization, distrust in the organizational processes about speaking up, about reporting bullying, reporting unfairness in the system. And what's nice about coaching is that you can actually start to intervene and support them in challenging some of those beliefs, some of those assumptions, but also challenging the system itself. But what I have found is that trying to get that qualitative data to have equal merit in the organization and be equally received as quantitative data is really quite a challenge. And I think Alex had some really nice examples.
Yes, thank you.
Where they have managed to do that successfully.
Sorry to thank you, Helen. Thank you, Patrick. Yes, absolutely. It became apparent to me quite early on when I started looking at this topic that quantitative data was always seen as the absolute. It's what people felt comfortable with. From a dashboard perspective, certainly, but also it's clear there's nothing that can be challenged about it. It's what it is. And the qualitative data was seen as less representative, particularly if it came from a small group of people. So what we did, which worked particularly effectively, was actually start asking the right questions. So we knew that there were some themes, some patterns emerging, asking those questions to a very broad sample of people across a number of different jurisdictions, in fact, but being very, very clear about what we were asking, not a high level, do you feel comfortable in your environment? Because that doesn't really tell you very much, but drilling down very specifically, defining the kinds of behaviors that we had heard about in that qualitative discussion, and actually asking those questions to those people, saying, how many times have you observed these behaviors? How many times in the last 6 to 12 months? And suddenly were you able to call out that behavior? Were you able to call it out if it was you that was the person who had the behavior directed at, or whether it was a bystander? Were you able to call it out as a bystander? And suddenly you had some really good quantitative data that you could present to management and have a better conversation, rather than just saying, well, there were some people over there who felt a little bit uncomfortable. Suddenly you had a much better way of presenting that information. But it's the key thing is asking the right questions.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, and this again circles back to what Carl was indicating. So when we start looking at the data, and our initial premise is what we're seeing is then asking further questions as we get underneath it. What is actually causing, if you like, the manifestation that we're seeing? And Helen, I would like, if I may, just to put something out there, but actually for all of you to consider. So we have this, if you like, stereotype of bankers wanting to see quantitative data because it's what we used to see. We used to see numbers. We like spreadsheets, etc., etc. We like dashboards. Numbers fit very nicely. Red, amber, green as well. That's all very nice. A third. But I can't remember who it was who said, but basically, if you give me a data point or you give me an anecdote, I will always choose the anecdote because the anecdote is the thing, the qualitative data that gives me richness. And as human beings, it's known that we learn through stories. That's how we've done it down through the millennia, quite frankly. And it has many more elements to it than a single number. So it's part of that asking questions to build the story, the anecdote around a particular piece. So here's a question. Should we be converting our qualitative data into quantitative, or should we be getting managers and senior managers to accept and relish and value the qualitative data that we can do and find a way to present that in a way that gives a richer picture of the organization to enable decisions?
So my view on that is the latter, that we should get people much more comfortable with accepting both quantitative and qualitative data. Because as you say, if you look at a number, and I used to love mathematics because it was finite, you were either right or you were wrong. But actually, if we want to train our organizations to be more willing to see the gray in the organization, if we want to actually understand the nuances of what really is going on below the surface, everyone has to get much more comfortable in understanding the behavioral aspects, that qualitative data, those sound bites, to really get under what is going on, what are people's perceptions, real or perceived, of how the organization operates.
Can I pick up on that? I completely agree with Helen. My experience is that hasn't always been successful in the first instance because people still feel that it's it comes back to that feeling unrepresentative. It's just, a bit random. It's not everybody. And I think that one thing which helps in that journey towards really accepting that qualitative data and feeling receptive towards it is actually thinking about what is blocking the speak up. Why is the speak up not encouraged? And seeing it from the perspective of management, particularly depending on your environment. It will vary from one to another, but in some environments, feedback is not particularly encouraged because it's a very top-down approach. The person who is at the top of the chain is meant to be in charge. And if you suddenly have all these reports coming in, questioning, having this constructive challenge, which I have to say my personal experience is seen as rather an Anglo-Saxon approach to a working environment, people do see it as undermining what they're seeking to achieve. And I've had some conversations with senior stakeholders who said, I decide the strategy, I just want my reports to implement it. They are on the operational side, they need to get on with it. And if they come to me with feedback, it's going to slow the process down. And so for me, it really became about how do you make sure that people have better conversations? So on the report side, making sure that they have toolkit to have a respectful speak up process. And there are many different ways that you can do this, but you really do need to support people in that because it's not easy. And on the management side, really to learn how to value that listen up. So go back to Helen's point about how do you really value this qualitative information that you're getting through? It's really, really helpful for you because it's going to nip things in the bud. It's part of that managing your controls more effectively, hearing what's going on.
I'm going to try and link that to Carl, because Carl is nodding furiously. But when you talk about that constructive feedback, and I want to link back to some of the conversations that we've had in the last couple of days as well. It's again about this purpose and strategy. And if we look at what strategy is, as he says, I decide the strategy. Well, I'd ask the question, well, how do you decide the strategy? What information do you use to decide that strategy? How do you know what's going on out there to decide that strategy? So strategy is actually, if you define it, Robert Ruffeld described it as this, it's the actions that you're taking to deal with a challenge or to take advantage of an opportunity. So the purpose of your organization, fundamentally, it's the actions, it's the plan. So how do you know what that challenge is? Who are the people who are going to give you that information? And those who are actually working with customers and clients are connected to the environment, or if you like, the client or the customer pool of your organization. And they're the ones who are going to give you feedback, which allows you to finesse your strategy. So that then becomes a value creating tool. It becomes a strategic tool, that feedback, again, if it's constructive. So if you're choking it off by creating an environment where I don't want to hear anything, no back chat, you are actually probably failing in your duties, particularly as a senior manager who's there, or even as a senior manager who's not from an SMCR or regulatory perspective, but as somebody who's supposed to be running a successful business. And this will connect us with the COO role. So the COO role as a strategy influencer to drive this could have access to this information. And then, so back to Carl's point about scaling. So this is about scaling. You say that, you may have one or two anecdotes that people are worried about speaking up. And you say, well, that's not enough. Well, what is the threshold? Because what it tells you is that there is an environment out there that's stopping people. And if it's stopping one or two people who have had the courage to say it's stopping me, how many people is it stopping who don't have the courage to say? So that is, again, your question. You're asking further questions as you go down. And so, Carl, maybe you can bring in here sort of maybe some of the methodology or the possibilities of bringing that scale, that quantitative approach to the value of the qualitative data that we start to see through, for example, some of the more enlightened approaches that Helen has described and that Alex has started to talk about.
Indeed, and just to build on both Helen and Alex's points there, I think that there is an inherent bias towards quantitative data, right? And we like quantitative data because when we think about it from an academic perspective, what quantitative data gives us, if it's statistically significant, so if the null hypothesis is true and the p-values are where they need to be and all that kind of stuff, is it gives us generalizability, which means that we can take one set of data and it gives us predictability of if you have this set of variables, then this should be the outcome that you're getting. And that's really simple, it's very intuitive, and it works extremely well for certain subjects. But having done an organizational behavior masters, what I sort of started to realize is that very powerful model has its flaws, has its weaknesses when we start to talk about human behavior, because it's much more complex than that. And actually, if we're looking for generalizability, if we're looking for statistical significance in our qualitative data, it might be worth us questioning, if we're getting qualitative data, is it actually statistically significant? Is this generalizable? Does the correlation necessarily equal causation? Or is this just a gut feel that we're seeing some numbers, they make us feel good, and therefore it must be true that there's causation underneath here? I think we need to be a little bit careful about the qualitative data that we consume, and we really question, is it actually more valuable than the quantitative data? Because we don't work in generalizable environments, right? We don't have an organizational culture. We have organizational cultures. There are many, many subcultures within teams, within functions, within organizations. So taking 3 or 4 anecdotal pieces of evidence from one team might actually be much more significant than looking at a quantitative metric, which has been done in a team which has a very, very different culture. So it's an interesting argument between qualitative and quantitative. And often what we find, if I just go back to my fish analogy, I do love my fish. When you look at a quantitative perspective, you might be on the outside of the fishbowl looking in, but you don't know what it's like inside that fishbowl. When you look at it from a qualitative perspective, you immerse yourself in that environment. And that's the kind of data that you actually want to get. So I think one of the things that we can do, and I'll just go back to what happens when you look at an occupational health intervention, for instance. Okay, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to do an occupational health assessment. But some of the best interventions in occupational health are to actually consult with the individuals that are affected and co-create some of those solutions. Helen, you were talking about when you coach people, you're getting a lot richer information. If you actually go out and talk to your folks to say, what is it that's stopping you from speaking up? And how can we actually change this? Let's co-create it together. I think that's one of the solutions which is really going to help improve the take-up. Let me just pause there.
Yeah. Carl, I mean, at the Academy, we talk about management by walking about as a culture tool. And it's exactly what you describe. It's what Helen has actually done, is go and talk to people. And by doing that, you think you're actually going and trying to get information, but you're also sending a very powerful message as a senior officer to say that actually I'm interested in what you've got to say. And you're already breaking down that fear of talking to senior management. So if you like, we're already nudging into, well, what can the COO do to make a difference, to create that environment of psychological safety? We've talked in many of the forums so far about setting an example. That's come out time and time again. Tone from the top, i.e., I usually call it action from the top as opposed to tone. But really setting the example and creating the environment where people feel they can speak out. And again, if we turn it around for those individuals from tell me your problems, tell me what's wrong. It's a negative thing, to tell me your ideas. Tell me how we can make this better. How can we make this business hum? How can we do that? And that way round, you as a senior leader are actually driving productivity within the organization. That is, again, your role. So we turn the argument around from this is something I have to do because I have to manage risk, to actually what I'm doing is I'm going to be driving profit and revenue. As a COO, having that influence on the organization, I think it could be a very, very powerful tool in their armory for basically running the business, which is their role after all. I mean, Rich, where's your thought? I mean, you've seen both sides of the fence from that perspective, and you've been obviously in the heart of a number of very contentious situations. But could you see in those situations where if you like, the driving force may have been about creativity, but it was pointed in the wrong direction? It could have been pointed in the right direction.
Could I just address one point in terms of the qualitative, quantitative?
Yes, please do.
That? Look, I think the regulator has a place to play here as well to set the agenda, right? Because you need to make decisions that are evidence-based, and evidence-based typically leads people to look at numbers within an organization. Something that was very beneficial in a previous role was when the regulator was turning back and saying, a similar organization to you raises this percentage of suspicious transaction reports. Why are you below or above that benchmark? And that led us to look at why we were below the benchmark. That led to, from metrics, it led to awareness, it led to training, it led to improvement, and it led to an increase in the number of STRs. So, of course, the whole industry is very nervous of sharing information with its competitors because of what's happened in the past. Everybody sits through anti-competition discussions and disclaimers prior to meeting with anybody from another organization. But where the regulator and frankly, where a bit of a plug for, I guess, Morris here, where these types of forums can really benefit the industry is by sharing information in a non-specific way. And I think that can help people understand where potentially there are gaps within their metrics that they're measuring and in the behaviors that they're engendering.
Rich, I'll send you your check later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. But you're right, and it is in these forums, and they're becoming more and more common, I think, in different parts of the organization, different functions.
Yeah,
that's the UK finance.
On the point of sort of, opportunities for raising concerns or raising areas where opportunity exists. Look, I have a slightly maybe archaic view on the discussion about strategy, right? I buy into the fact that the boss decides the strategy. There is a period of time allocated in a cycle that strategy is determined and decided. Feedback is given into that. You can't have everybody within an organization questioning and deciding strategy if they are there to execute on that strategy. However, where there are issues preventing that strategy from being executed, we have to encourage people to speak up around that. So if the CEO decides we're going to close our Asia business, the CEO has decided on that as a result of numerous meetings and discussions that they've had. If that's going to lead to a reputational risk or a fundamental concern around the longevity or appropriateness of the business, then everybody should be able to speak up and raise concerns about that. But it's a strategic decision that has happened, and I believe that the encouragement of challenge to strategy versus the encouragement of challenge to where there are areas of concerns and problems are two very different things. That may be a bit controversial.
I don't know about the others, but I don't think it is, because the reality is that strategy is going to be more robust if it has taken into account what the business is capable of doing. And that requires feedbacks and understanding of performance, of motivation, of capability, and how people are aligned with the purpose, so they understand what is trying to be done. And therefore the strategy is better informed. So that's when we move away. And I'm still trying to think of a term that replaces speak up, because it has this connotation of challenging things as opposed to innovation, or giving feedback and ideas and bringing, bubbling up from the bottom, from those people who actually know the business extremely well, getting information from that allows managers to make better decisions. So asking better questions, if you like. But I think you're right. I mean, the fact is that strategy is a course of action. And you certainly want to know if you're not going to be able to execute it because you've got whether it's a morale problem or a capability problem in your organization. That is your role. That is your duty as a senior manager, to know that and to be able to address it. So
I do think, though, just to add on the opportunity for raising concerns, starting your bi-weekly supervisory meeting with your team on a one-to-one basis with what's on your mind is an incredibly powerful question, rather than let's go through the financial metrics, because the tone of that conversation starts with what would you like to talk about? Is that an innovative opportunity that you have? Is it a concern that, well, I didn't really want to bring it up, but can we have this confidential conversation? We have to give people multiple different ways of raising either concerns or opportunities. And that can be within forums of like-minded individuals, different individuals, with their managers, with people outside of the industry. People will find different ways to raise their concerns because we're all different. And we've got to have as many of those different opportunities as possible. I've been surprised at how few conversations, one-to-one conversations, start with what's on your mind.
You make a very, very strong point. And I'm going to turn to Carl from a behavioral perspective, but then perhaps to Alex and Helen as well to comment on this, because when we look at if we're digging into behavior and psychological safety, one of the key ways of building psychological safety, or another word for it, is trust. That people trust that you are going to do the right thing, take into account their concerns, but also listen to their ideas and maybe say, actually, that's a good idea. And elements of that, and I could almost hear Morris grinding his teeth when I say this, is quite an element of humility as a senior manager, that you don't have all the answers. So you're asking for that. And if we look at the dynamics, behavioral dynamics, psychology, and Carl, please tell me if I'm really way off base here, is that the way you build trust is by giving something. It's reciprocity. And what you're doing, what you've just described, Rich, is saying, I'm giving you my ears, I'm interested, I'm giving you my attention. And in return, hopefully what they will do is give you a response. And that is a dynamic which starts to build rebuild or enhance trust. And you're already, as you've just described, creating a space of psychological safety where discussions can happen. And it's a small event than having the big blowhole for a whistleblowing in terms of actually starting to see where things could be improved. Carl, am I off base with that?
No, absolutely. I'd agree with all of that, Patrick. I think one of the ways to build trust is, to be able to build a rapport with somebody. That, building rapport with your, and you talked about sort of management by walking around. Building rapport with the people that you work with is super important to trust. And one of the ways to build rapport is to really listen. And I think this is one of the things that senior managers, for one reason or another, maybe they're super busy, maybe they don't think it's their role, but that active listening role is actually a skill, and you've got to practice that skill if you're ever going to get good at it. So active listening, that process of not just thinking about what you're going to say, but actually hearing what the person is saying and going, that's interesting, let me put my opinions to one side and let me really consume what this person is saying. So trust is almost a result of building rapport, of credibility, of reliability, but it can be destroyed or it can be taken away by that sort of like narcissistic self-orientation view. So one of the things that we look at when we're coaching, for instance, in Psionic, is we look at what are the things that could actually destroy trust, because as human beings, we're kind of programmed to want to trust each other and exist in groups. But what sometimes our structures and our pressures do is they introduce an environment, they introduce elements that actually destroy that. And I think understanding what destroys trust and not doing it is actually absolutely key to building it. I don't know if that resonates for folks. Alex, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, there. Completely, because I think one of the things which undermines everything that we want to achieve with Speak Up, and I have seen this happen, is where somebody proffers a view and the person whom is being spoken up to goes, well, that's complete nonsense, and does it maybe in an open forum, and it is very, very damaging. And it not only goes much further than that, it sends real ripples out in terms of undermining everything one wants to do in this space. So I think that maybe that is also part of who is actually doing the Speak Up. We've talked a lot over the last few days, and like you, I agree that so many very interesting speakers and events over the course of the last 3 days, is who is actually speaking up. If we really want this cognitive diversity, this diversity of thought, is the person who is being who is actually speaking up on this particular occasion, who's proffering a view, and they're being shut down. Why are they being shut down? Are they being shut down because they come from a different business area, because they haven't built up that that sense of being part of the inner team? That is really, really powerful. And I think that's where the CEOs can really come in and listen to what is going on, because sometimes it may be that that person who's spoken up isn't going to be heard, but they need to build an alliance with other people who are closer to those people who can make a difference. And so I think one of the Speak Up strategies is maybe not to speak up directly sometimes, but to speak to other people who can convey that message as well, so that you build up this sense of agreement around what is necessary. But I completely agree, Carl. You can shut it down so quickly, and once you shut it down, it's incredibly hard to resurrect.
So can I build on that? And Helen, I'm going to come to you for this, perhaps. Excuse me, because of course there's no warning of where this is going to go. Is in the last session we were talking about, which was the COO, how they respond from the crisis, and what lessons can be learned and the role that they take. We talked quite a bit about training, and there was a discussion about training being either whether it's a control, is it a governance tool, what is it? And yes, it was an enhancement and development tool. That's what people expect. But as a former compliance officer, I've seen many people actually list training as a control, and I've sort of rolled my eyes very slightly when I've seen that. It's only control if it actually works. So it's not the training, it's the outcome. So what we've seen there is Carl talking about listening. Listening is a skill that can be trained potentially. And from a COO's perspective, the COO has influence. It has, one of those tentacles of levers is human resources, development, all of those aspects. And we're talking governance here. To what extent, if you like, and maybe I'm making this too complex, can something like listening be part of a training tool, which is part of a governance structure because it enables information to flow as it should do, escalation, information up and down. It's unblocking the channels of communication, which are fundamental for your governance structure to work. That's where I'm getting up. So again, from the COO's perspective, the authority and the influence they have to unblock those channels and create that as part of the governance structure. Discuss.
I agree. Having sat as a COO in the past, it is a very privileged position to sit there as the balanced voice of reason between the business and all of the functions, and to represent and always have in mind the business as a whole, and not to fall into the silo. And having gone through this coaching training and having specifically learnt those questions that coaches use, I think it should be required training for every leader. And I say this because my thesis for INSEAD was looking at agile transformation in the banking sector. And I interviewed a number of people who had gone through that. And I didn't ask any questions about fear or what are your fears or what are your thoughts on the traditional organization, but it was really interesting what people talked about. They talked about, it was fantastic. The managers came and sat with me at my desk and talked to me about what I was working on. So it was that physical breaking down of barriers coming out of your office, which is, people see the office as a symbol of power and success, but actually coming out and sitting with people was really powerful. People also talked about, some of the feedback was incredible, and what it said about the traditional organization. You'd see people holding on to tasks for a long period of time because they didn't want to say that they had a problem that they weren't able to solve. You have authority, but you're not exercising it. When you're a subject matter expert, you need to be right. You need to be accurate. That's your job, to get it right. It's probably how they've been brought up, but you don't expose your dirty washing in public. In the normal work environment, getting something wrong is usually frowned upon. And what I liked about the agile ceremonies, and agile is not necessarily a panacea for all banking ills, but there are specific ceremonies or meetings within agile that really work to improve trust, to practice speaking up, to reflecting on what has gone right and what has not gone so well. And so again, when people talked about agile, they talked about you need to fail sometimes to learn from your mistakes. Agile facilitates that in a good way without slapping you on the wrist for it. Again, think about the traditional organization. You're going to get slapped on the wrist if you do something wrong. And then people talked about these retrospectives where you go through what went right, what went wrong in the last piece of work that we did. And the user stories, sitting with clients, hearing what they had to say. They talked about bringing honesty into the process, taking the myths off the table, recognizing that the organization isn't perfect. So you can undo all of this if you still have egos, if you don't listen, if you don't collaborate, if you think siloed mentality. But this creates potentially the opportunity for you to introduce those dialogues on a day-to-day basis. And you can see, people holding on to problems, not solving them, people not taking up authority, layering approval layers. This is where if you get this right and you can get people talking and being open, you'll see the benefits because you won't need 15 layers of approval. You'll just have one person who's willing to take accountability for that decision. You won't have something take 8 weeks to get through because the person doesn't know how to kind of get through the problem. It will be solved and they'll ask for help. And so that was my findings from that study were really quite powerful there.
this is your personal experience, and personal experiences always count. And I think that's very powerful indeed. I mean, coaching training, something that we have proselytized about at the academy time and time again for all managers and senior managers, because it's about asking questions and therefore listening. That's what coaching is about. But you raise this point about agile. We've had a lot of conversations over the past few months with the CEO community about operational resilience. And the conversation time and time again came back to psychological safety, interestingly enough, and behavior and self-leadership and challenge and courage. And when you think about it, it's because people are willing to respond and therefore have ideas and present ideas and be happy to fail, for those ideas to be incorrect, but to learn from them, which is again a very strong cultural epithet. And when you look at governance, again, governance, it requires you fundamentally to be able to learn from errors, to prevent errors in the future. You can only do that by learning from mistakes. You only learn from mistakes if you accept mistakes. Like the Civil Aviation Authority, how they did it was genuine mistakes are absolutely blame-free. Absolutely blame-free. We must learn from them. Deliberate misconduct, different matter. And that then is again about this justice and fairness. You reminded me of, I mentioned at the beginning, I was a diplomat before I went into banking. When I went into banking, curiously enough, I went to INSEAD to do my MBA, to convert from public to private sector, if you like. And my father, who was in investment banking for many, many years, the one piece of advice he gave me when I went into investment banking was, you have to be reliable. And then he qualified it. And what I mean by that is you have to be honest. If you can't do something, you must say you can't do something. You must ask for help. You must raise your hand. Because if you say you're going to do something and you fail, that is the worst thing you can do. It was not about fear. It was about honesty and openness and actually having the courage to say, actually, I need help here. And that stuck very, very firmly in my mind when I came into the industry. But it's something that I think you've just described, many of you have, that, and the Kweku Adeboli case is that, there is a fear of failure. There is a fear of raising concerns as opposed to fixing stuff and being somebody who is an expert 100% and can sort it out, whether or not you can, and giving that impression as opposed to actually the outcome that is important, and can create enormous problems like the UBS, as opposed to, funnily enough, Rich, I met Kweku some years ago, and I asked him about this, and I said, so why didn't you put your hand up when it got to, I don't know, 200 million or 20 million or 2 million? And he said exactly this, it was a culture where you found solutions. Right? You didn't raise concerns, you didn't raise problems. So he was trying to fix it in the best way he knew how. And the environment that he was in led him to think that this was the best way for him to do that in this environment. So not speaking up. So from the COO's perspective, do you think, Helen, Alex, Rich, who have been in these roles, what the COO can do to actually not to break it, because we don't think there's a question of breaking the mold or breaking the crust on this. Is there one thing from each of you that you think a COO can take forward to start making a difference, if a difference is needed, either to foster an already okay environment, to drive it forward and switch it from speaking up to innovation, or to actually try to fix something which may not be as it should be, that a COO could do? What would you choose? Rich, can I go to you first?
Yeah, I've got a slight curveball one.
Good, excellent.
Might make you laugh, but I've been reading a book recently called Why We Sleep. Many people have read it. It's quite a popular book, and I think one of the takeaways would be, don't rush back to the office, because a number of statistics within this book. Firstly, leaders that get by on less sleep tend to demonstrate more abusive behaviors and are less successful at enthusing their employees, and they're less charismatic. The other takeaway is underslept employees are more likely to blame others for their own mistakes and try to take the credit for the others' successful work. And finally, it's about a 6-hour boundary, but less than 6 hours of sleep versus more than 6 hours of sleep, more likely to follow a deviant behavioral pattern and more likely to lie on expenses and create false claims. So, I'm sure there's a lot of nervousness around how we can supervise employees in a remote environment. But actually, if they're getting a lot more sleep, the outcome of that may well be more beneficial for the organization as a whole.
But before I come to Alex and Helen on this, and Carl, I would like your opinion too on this. I would refer our audience, if they haven't done it, to go and listen to the behavioral analytics conversation we had yesterday, where we had Andrew McDonald from we've lost Carl. No, we haven't. Yes, there we go. Where they talk about basically performance quotient, and they talk about stress and sleep in exactly this environment, and the extent to which data can now, you can use data to measure the stress and sleep performance of your employees and know when they're going to be able to operate at capacity. And as an operating officer, all of you will understand, and particularly engineers, the concept of process operations management. So the capacity, and when you reach capacity and blocking, and certainly pipeline blocks that happen when your capacity is lowered, but you're still pushing at the same level, demanding the same amount. Same for human beings. So it's a way of measuring the inputs and therefore the likely capacity of your greatest resource, your people. So it's not crazy, and it's not a curveball. It's absolutely part of the way that we perhaps will be thinking in the future about managing our greatest resource and how we can optimize it and make them more productive not by squeezing the pips, by actually giving them greater freedom and greater sense of comfort, if you like, and therefore enthusiasm. Get the intrinsic motivation as opposed to that extrinsic. Move from carrot and stick to something else. Great stuff, Rich. Thank you very much. I'm going to go. Who shall I go to? Who haven't we heard from for a while? Alex.
Yes, I do like that, Rich. I think it's very, very powerful about sleep. Coming back to the question about what COOs can do, as I said earlier, I think they're in an immensely privileged position. They are part of that inner circle. They know what's going on. I would say one of the most powerful things that can be done in order to foster the kind of environments we want is when we say we want to see certain kinds of behaviors, to follow that through. One thing I found very important is if we say we want to see certain kinds of behaviors, we say we want to see speak up, we say we want feedback, and then it gets shut down. If you as a CEO see that behavior, that it is being shut down, it is actually countering the direction of travel. If you can call it out in the moment in a respectful way, that is one of the most powerful things you can do, and will send a very, very clear message that this is the kind of behavior we want to see. No, that wasn't okay, actually. Sometimes I appreciate one has to be sensitive to these things. It can be incredibly difficult, but don't leave it there. Follow it up afterwards. That conversation we had, that difficult conversation, that's not creating trust in our environment. And let's think about why we want that trust to be there. And I think being able to call things out either in the moment or following up afterwards will have a very powerful impact.
Is there another side to that coin? That when somebody does do that behavior, to go up and say, that's exactly what I'm talking about, brilliant stuff. And this takes us to the conversation I think we had yesterday about reward. So with Tracy and so on, what are the ways that we can actually find the behavior, measure it and reward it? It may not be granular, it may not be quantitative. There are ways to do that, I can assure you, but that is an exact example of rewarding the right sort of behavior, which then fosters it, and other people will see that and then they will follow suit. So it becomes a very powerful tool. And if you do it, line managers will do it. If line managers do it, other line managers will do it.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. I completely agree with that. But I think both need to happen. And one of the things that I have observed is sometimes people don't feel quite brave enough. Don't be that person. Be brave. Do it either in the moment or do it afterwards, but do something.
Excellent. Thank you. Helen.
So I guess mine would be for the COOs to be really aware of how balanced they're being, and make sure that you're being that balanced voice, not the flunky of the business head. And if you find yourself going down that route, pull yourself back and go and talk to some of the functions and go and make sure that you're rebuilding that trust, because there is a horizontal power or hierarchy that we often don't talk about, but can be very dangerous in organizations, where the business can sometimes act like lords of the manor You've got the COO as the head of the house, and then you've got all of the functions as the servants. That's a really dangerous dynamic. And the role of the COO is really to make sure that everybody has an equal voice.
Which is a reflection of the concept of cognitive diversity again, breaking down silos, getting everybody together, cracking heads perhaps to make sure that people are all talking openly, honestly, and not basically trying to control for their own agenda. For the good of the organization, the good of the client, the good of the purpose of the organization. Wonderful, thank you. Carl.
So if I can just build on, I agree with everything that's been said. If I can just build on it a little bit, going back to Helen, what you were talking about in terms of agile transformation and some of the ceremonies that exist within agile promote certain mindsets and certain choices. So for instance, the daily Scrum meeting, where you'll look at a Kanban board, really simple visual tool, everything on there, and you'll go, okay, so the team, the Scrum Master might say, okay, team, you are empowered, you have autonomy. Let's understand what it is that you're working on, what it is that you're going to work on, and what's getting in your way. And as a Scrum Master, I'm a servant leader. I'm here to help you remove some of those barriers. So you can see in that particular example that the process itself has created a certain environment, right? And I think what COOs can do is they can architect small changes in the context in which people make choices. So I'll give you an example. I was working with a COO in equities, and that person noticed that there were a unacceptable to that person degree of compliance risk around cross-border rules. So people flying, remember when you used to fly? People flying across the pond, as it were, and meeting a client who happened to walk into the office straight away. They haven't attested to the cross-border rules. There's a possible risk there. So that COO's very, very small little intervention said, hey, could we send that person, as soon as they book their ticket, could we send them an email with maybe not all of the whole cross-border policy, but just a subset of the cross-border policy so they can read it and they can understand the rules. And then when they get to the airport, can we send them another automated email? And of course, to send someone an automated email based on data that the organization already has is a relatively straightforward thing to do. So when they're in the airport, they can read that again. And what we're doing is we're just nudging them in the direction of making good choices. We're giving them the information because they don't intend to break any rules, but we're giving them the information exactly what they need and when they need it. And Patrick, you've talked about the British cycling team, and I think this is very akin to that. I think COOs have a massive opportunity to maybe just make very small little changes to the context in which people make choices. They have a lot of license to do that, to make these small changes, constantly make these small changes. And what we can see is as those build up, you can see a real difference in the way people make choice. Now, you might say there are always going to be people that want to break it regardless. But what you can start to do is you can start to filter those individuals that would not rationally do that from those individuals that are going to want to break rules on purpose, as it were. So I think a COO has a tremendous license to make those small little changes in choice architecture, as it were.
Well, again, it becomes not just an individual, but a cultural change, because if you have those majority of people are behaving in a certain way, they set the example. And that behavior, as we know, culture is an aggregate of behaviors. The more people behaving a certain way, that becomes a stronger form of the culture. And it's the culture that informs behavior. People look at it, and that's how they behave. So those who might be more inclined to break the rules will now be less inclined because they're taking example from everybody else. Yeah. The majority.
We like to say it at Psionic that culture is behavioral at scale. Yeah. Behavior at scale.
There we go. So very powerful. And I like the point that we talked about the servant leader. in that. And that takes us right back to the first webinar on Monday morning, where we talk about them, some of the examples that we take from the military, when we talk about mission-oriented training, but also the concept of certainly the British military, but also the US, and it started by the Canadian military about enabling people. Started in, I think Morris said, or was it Stuart Tutel said, it was something like 1870 something or other, 77, when the concept of actually enabling those people who are on the ground to make better decisions there and then was the role of leaders. So back to that leadership concept of serve to lead, which is what the mantra of Sandhurst Officer Training College is. We serve to lead, and that concept becomes perhaps removes what you described. I think the ego, Helen. This is the ego environment, and brings a touch of that humility to open up the possibilities of what the majority of people who are not the senior leaders and the ones who are actually facing the client base are able to do to leverage what's inside them, their moral compass, if you like, all of that. But they are helped to make better decisions by the environment around them. So, these are, as you see, we can start to see from the COO's perspective some powerful and sometimes relatively cheap approaches to making a massive difference to driving culture. And as we go into this, I'm conscious. I'm just checking. We've just got a few minutes. One of the things we've been talking about today is 3 lines of defense. There have been a number of efforts with Armstrong Wolf. We've been looking at the 3 lines of defense, getting COO's perspective on it, and it is a subject which is close to many people's hearts. And from a regulatory perspective, is something the regulator is interested in. So as we look at the COO as a potential culture vector, how they can influence, as you've described, Helen, beyond what will they just do, and what you described, Rich, and as well about the horizontal approach to everybody else. This becomes more and more the expectation of the regulator, and yet, thankfully, it is also something which will drive innovation and drive performance in the organization. So how can we not do it? I mean, how can we not go and choose the tools, find the tools, put in place the framework, create the training, if you like, environment to enable everybody at every level to be able to do this? It's only going to make the business better, right? So, listen, this has been extraordinary. I would just, we've got, I think, a couple of minutes left on our schedule, literally 2 minutes. And perhaps I could ask each of you to give us just 30-second takeaway. You've given us some wonderful examples of things you can do, or just 1 or 2 things that you would just like our audience to take away from this, and then we'll close up. Rich, go with you.
I would try to channel my inner Warren Buffett. His famous quote: "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you will do things differently." It's a quote I had above my desk for many, many years, and always referred to it when we had new employees coming in the door.
Nice, concise, to the point, and quite potent. Thank you. Helen.
I'm definitely going to sleep more. I do recognize I am one of those people who gets very grumpy when I haven't had enough sleep. So thanks for the reminder, Rich.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Alex.
Yes, no, I agree with that on the sleep one. I've already pointed that out. I think that's excellent advice. I think is everybody can make a difference. I think that so often it's like, that's okay, that's somebody else's responsibility, but everybody can make a difference in this space. And I think that that is such an important thing to remember. What you do will impact somebody, and you may not even, you won't be aware of it most of the time. So just always bear that in mind, I think.
Thank you. Carl.
And I would say in this environment of information overload, if you want people to make better choices, make them simple.
Simplicity is best. Not always easy, but if we find a way to do it, then that's the way to go. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all enormously for what I think has been quite a wide ranging, and we've dived deep, we've gone high, we've gone round, we've gone across, and we've had one or two curveballs. Thank you, Rich, for that, to consider. And hopefully we've given some real food for thought. The way governance seems to be a requirement, it actually can be an enabler for the business as well, if we get it right. And if we understand the levers of behavior, decision making within it, that we can create a structure which supports the right sort of conduct and culture to deliver purpose in the business. So Helen, Alex, Rich, and Carl, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being part of this and for bringing your experience and your wisdom to the table.